The air in the proctor's office was a curated absence, a sterile vacuum where scent went to die, meticulously scrubbed of the pheromonal static that defined the world outside its hermetically sealed door. Alien sat on the edge of a chrome and white polymer chair, his spine a rigid line of perfect compliance. He had been trained for this posture, for this stillness. His hands rested on his knees, palms down, fingers aligned. He was a portrait of obedience, a testament to the Institute's success. The only sound was the subliminal hum of the environmental controls, a low thrum that vibrated deep in his bones, a constant reminder of the machine in which he lived. He did not look at the man behind the desk. He focused on a point on the opposing wall where the white paint was so flawless it seemed to absorb the light, leaving a void. It was a familiar void. He carried a similar one inside himself. He was Subject 734. He was an Omega. He was a null. The categories were precise, clinical, and absolute. They were the load-bearing walls of his reality. He had been taught that his own biology was a defect, a chaotic variable that required stringent control. The daily regimen of suppressants, the neurological dampeners, the somatic conditioning, it had all been designed to smooth him into a perfect, predictable surface. No scent, no heats, no inconvenient emotional responses. He was a ghost, a perfect null. It was a lie. A quiet, persistent tremor lived beneath the placid surface of his conditioning, a phantom limb of feeling he could not name. It was there now, a subtle vibration in his chest that had nothing to do with the building's humming heart. Proctor Kalen had been watching him for 7 minutes and 13 seconds. Elian had counted the ticks of the chronometer embedded in the desk without turning his head. The silence was not a void. It was a presence. It was a scalpel, and Kalen was methodically using it to peel back the layers of Elian's composure. Most proctors were all sharp edges and broadcast dominance. Their alpha pheromones a constant, low-grade pressure designed to enforce submission. Kalen was different. His presence was a weighted stillness, a gravitational pull that was far more unsettling. He radiated an authority that had no need for pheromonal shouting. He was an alpha, of course. The faint, clean scent of ozone and cold stone that clung to him was evidence enough, even to Elian's muted senses. But it was a scent kept on a tight leash. It was controlled, precise, like everything else about him. Finally, he spoke. His voice was a low baritone, calm and measured, devoid of the condescension Elian had come to expect. Subject 734. Elian's gaze remained fixed on the white wall. Proctor. The response was automatic, the tone perfectly neutral. It was a sound he had practiced until it was no longer his own. Look at me. It was not a request. Elian's obedience was a reflex arc, bypassing conscious or thought. His head turned, his eyes lifting to meet the proctor's. Kalen was not what he had expected up close. The hollow screens and distant sightings in the evaluation chambers did not capture the details. His hair was the color of wet slate, a few strands of silver catching the cold, recessed light. His eyes were a startling pale gray, the color of a winter sky before a storm. They were intelligent, analytical, and held a depth that made Elian's internal tremor intensify. He looked at Elian not as a subject, not as a data point, but as a complex equation he was trying to solve. They told me you were the pinnacle of the null protocol, Kalen said, his voice quiet, almost conversational, perfectly balanced, unresponsive to external stimuli. A clean slate. He paused, his grey eyes scanning Elian's face, lingering for a fraction of a second too long on his own reflection in Elian's dilated pupils. "They are wrong." The words were a stone dropped into the placid pool of Elian's conditioning. Ripples of confusion spread outwards, disrupting the perfect stillness. Wrong. The Institute was never wrong. The protocol was absolute. To be a perfect null was the highest aspiration. It meant safety. It meant survival. "I have followed my directives, Proctor," Elian said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The tremor was stronger now, a flutter behind his sternum, like a trapped bird. Kalen leaned forward slightly, the movement economical and deliberate. The scent of ozone sharpened, a clean, electric smell that pricked at the edges of Elian's awareness. "You have. Impeccably. Your file is a monument to compliance, but your file is not you." He stood, and the motion was fluid, silent. He was tall, his form clad in the severe grey uniform of the Institute's upper echelon. He moved around the desk, his presence eclipsing the sterile white room, drawing all the light and shadow toward himself. He stopped beside Elian's chair, close enough that Elian could feel the faint warmth radiating from his body. It was a foreign sensation, an intrusion into his personal, refrigerated space. Elian's training screamed at him to remain still, to show no reaction, to be a statue. But an involuntary instinct, buried deep beneath layers of chemical and psychological suppression, urged him to lean away, to shrink from the proximity of this alpha. He did neither. He remained perfectly, terrifyingly still. Kalen did not loom. He simply stood, a silent monolith. "You're different, 734, he said again, his voice even lower now, a resonant murmur that seemed to bypass Elian's ears and settle directly into his bones. Not broken, not flawed, different. He walked past him toward the door. The sound of his footsteps on the polished floor was the only sound in the universe. Elian watched his back, the straight line of his spine, the controlled power in his shoulders. He reached the door. The soft chime of the lock, disengaging, was followed by a heavy, definitive click as it re-engaged. A magnetic seal hissed into place. They were locked in, together. Elian's heart, a muscle he had been taught to ignore, began to beat a frantic, panicked rhythm against the cage of his ribs. The white wall across from him no longer looked like a void. It looked like the edge of a world that had just ended. Kalen turned, his face unreadable, his pale eyes holding Elian's gaze. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. For the first time in his memory, Elian felt like something else entirely. He felt like prey. From Kalen's perspective, the boy, he refused to think of him by his designation, was a masterpiece of psychological architecture, and Kalen himself had been one of its chief architects. He saw the subtle tells the other proctors missed, the minute tightening of the muscles around the eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in his breathing pattern, the way his stillness was not placid but was instead a state of immense, compressed tension. It was the stillness of a guitar string pulled taut to its breaking point. Subject 734, Elian, was the culmination of a decade of his life's work, a project he had come to despise with a cold, quiet fury that he kept banked like embers deep within himself. The Null Protocol had been born from a desire for order, a societal solution to the perceived chaos of Omega biology. It was meant to be a kindness, a liberation from the tyranny of heats and the vulnerability of pheromonal influence. That had been the sales pitch, the lie he had told himself in the early years. But it had become a process of erasure, a systematic dismantling of the self, replacing vibrant, complex individuals with hollow-eyed, compliant shells. He had watched them, the nulls, moving through the Institute's pristine halls like elegant automatons, their humanity scrubbed away along with their scent, and he had felt the slow, creeping rot of his own complicity. Elian was supposed to be the final, perfect iteration, the one whose baseline psyche was so stable, whose genetic markers so receptive that the conditioning would take root completely, leaving no trace of the person beneath. As Kalen had said, they were wrong. He had seen it in the data first. Anomalous biofeedback readings during stress simulations, a flicker of REM sleep activity that suggested complex narrative dreams, something unheard of in a fully conditioned null. Trace elements in his hormonal panels that hinted at a system fighting back, a deep cellular rebellion against the suppressants. He had started observing Elian directly, pulling archival footage, watching him in the sterile commons, in the nutrient dispensaries. He saw the way Elian's eyes would track the flight of a dust mote in a sunbeam, a flicker of focused attention that was too pure, too curious for a null. He saw the way his fingers would ghost over a textured wall panel, a subconscious search for sensory input. These were not malfunctions. They were signs of life. They were cracks in the perfect facade, and through those cracks, Kalen saw a chance for absolution. Locking the door was the first irreversible step. It was an act of treason against the system he had helped build, and a declaration of intent. He was no longer an architect of this prison. He was now its saboteur. He turned from the sealed door and looked at the boy, who was still frozen in that posture of perfect submission, his face a pale, beautiful mask of neutrality. But Kalen could see the terror in his eyes now, a wild animal fear that the conditioning was failing to contain. Good. Fear was an emotion. It was a start. "My name is Kalen," he said, breaking the first rule of proctor-subject interaction. Personalization was forbidden. "You will no longer refer to me as Proctor. You will no longer refer to yourself as Subject 734. Your name is Elian." The boy's throat worked, a visible swallow. His lips parted, but no sound emerged. The conflict was warring within him, the ingrained obedience fighting the shocking, terrifying introduction of a new paradigm. Kalen walked to a plain white panel on the wall and pressed his palm against it. With a soft, pneumatic hiss, a section of the wall recessed, revealing a small alcove. It was a simple kitchenette, but to a resident of the Institute, it was an impossible sight. There was a water dispenser that filtered water into a real glass, not a polymer tube. There was a cooling unit containing not nutrient paste packs, but actual food. Fruit, bread, cheese. Things Elian would have only seen in historical data files. "The conditioning you have undergone is extensive," Kalen continued, his back to Elian as he took out a deep red apple, its surface gleaming under the cold lights. "It is woven into your neurology, your endocrine system, your very muscle memory. It cannot be undone with words alone." He turned, holding the apple. He saw the way Elian's eyes widened, almost imperceptibly, tracking the object as if it were a dangerous alien artifact. "Your system has been starved of genuine sensory input. It has been fed a constant, monotonous diet of neutrality. We are going to change that." He placed the apple on the desk, midway between them. It sat there, a vibrant splash of color in the monochrome room, a symbol of everything the Institute had sought to eliminate: nature, imperfection, life. "This is a recalibration," Kalen said. "Think of it as an experiment. But this time, the desired outcome is not compliance. It is authenticity." He moved to another panel, this one controlling the room's environment. He tapped the smooth surface. The low, oppressive hum of the building's systems faded, replaced by an unnerving, absolute silence. Then, another tap. The sterile, recycled air was slowly replaced by something else. The scent was subtle at first, then richer. Damp earth, wet leaves, the smell of a forest after rainfall. Petrichor. It was a scent simulation, of course, a high-fidelity atmospheric rendering, but it was designed to trigger the most primitive, dormant parts of the brain. Elian flinched. His whole body went rigid, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. His head tilted, like an animal sensing a change in the wind. His nostrils flared. It was the first truly unconditioned response Kalen had witnessed from him. He watched, his own heart a steady, heavy beat in his chest. He was playing with forces he barely understood. He had written the manuals on how to suppress an Omega's nature, but there were no texts on how to carefully, safely restore it. He was walking into uncharted territory, guided only by a decade of regret and a fragile, desperate hope. The boy, Elian, was trembling, not from fear now, but from a massive systemic shock. His carefully constructed world, the sterile, predictable cage in which he had lived his entire life, was being dismantled, piece by piece, by the very man who held the key. He was not here to be punished. He was not here to be decommissioned. He was here to be reborn. And Kalen knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the process would be excruciating. The silence was the first assault. Elian had lived his entire life cocooned in the low-frequency hum of the Institute, a sound so constant it had become a part of his own physiology. Its absence was a physical blow, leaving a ringing void in his ears. He felt exposed, stripped bare. Then came the scent. It was alien, a complex tapestry of odors he had no names for. It was rich and dark and alive. It smelled of soil and decay and green, growing things. It bypassed the rational part of his mind and sank its hooks directly into his lizard brain, stirring something dormant and ancient. His conditioning screamed at him that this was a contaminant, a dangerous variable. His body, however, betrayed him. A deep, shuddering breath escaped his lips, unbidden. The air tasted thick, real. It filled his lungs in a way the sterile, recycled air of the Institute never had. He felt a dizzying wave of vertigo, as if the floor had dropped away from beneath him. His gaze darted from the impossible apple on the desk to the man, Kalen, who watched him with an unnerving, clinical patience. This was a test. It had to be a test, a new, more complex simulation to gauge his resistance to deviation. The objective was to remain neutral, to show no response. He focused on that thought, clinging to it like a lifeline. Neutrality, compliance, control. He forced his breathing to even out, his clenched fist to relax. He tried to rebuild the white walls of his inner world, to block out the overwhelming sensory input. But it was like trying to cup water in his hands. The scent seeped through his defenses. The silence pressed in. The vibrant red of the apple burned a hole in his vision. "What is the objective of this protocol, Proctor?" he asked, his voice strained, a hairline crack in the smooth veneer of his composure. He had used the forbidden word. Proctor. It was a reflex, a desperate grasp for the familiar structure of his world. Kalen did not correct him. He simply walked to the sound system embedded in the wall and activated it. There was no jarring alarm, no instructional chime. A sound bloomed in the silent room, soft at first, then swelling. It was music, not the metronomic, functional tones played in the nutrient halls to regulate consumption rates. This was complex, layered, and saturated with an emotion Elian could not identify. A stringed instrument wept a long, melancholic note, joined by the deeper, resonant voice of another. It was a sound full of texture and color, a narrative of sorrow and beauty that he had no framework to understand. Yet he felt it. He felt it in his chest, a strange, aching pressure behind his ribs. It was unpleasant. It was profound. It was everything. The music, the scent, the silence. It was a coordinated attack on the foundations of his being. The null protocol was designed to sever the connection between sensory input and emotional response. What he was experiencing now was a forced, violent reconnection. He felt a phantom itch under his skin. His vision swam. The perfect white walls of the office seemed to pulse in time with the sad, beautiful music. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the images were already inside his head. A dark, wet forest, a sky the color of bruises, the heartbreaking cry of the cello. "Stop," he whispered, the word a ragged tear in the fabric of the sound. It was the first time in his life he had ever given a command, the first time he had ever expressed a desire. The music did not stop. Kalen's voice cut through it, calm and steady. "The objective, Elian, is for you to ask that question again, but not because your programming demands it, but because you, yourself, want to know the answer." Elian opened his eyes. Kalen was standing by the desk, his expression unchanged. But his scent, that clean smell of ozone and stone, had deepened. It was no longer just a sterile, electric smell. There was something else beneath it now, something warmer, more complex. Pine, resin, and smoke. It was an alpha's scent, a true one, not the chemically masked version he presented to the Institute. And for the first time, Elian's suppressed biology reacted. A faint, tingling warmth spread from the base of his spine, a cellular hum of awareness that was both terrifying and intoxicating. His own scent, long buried under layers of chemical suppressants, tried to answer. He felt a ghost of a fragrance rise in his throat. What it was he didn't know. It was weak, confused, a newborn thing. He clamped down on it with all the force of his conditioning, a lifetime of training in self-denial. A wave of nausea and dizziness washed over him. The room tilted, the lights blurring into streaks. He slumped forward, his forehead hitting the cool, smooth surface of the desk with a soft thud. The music played on. The scent of the forest filled his head. The red apple sat in his peripheral vision, a silent, patient promise of a world he had never known. He was not a subject. He was not a null. He was a tightly locked room. And this man, this alpha, was systematically picking every lock, one by one. The fear was a living thing inside him now, but it was no longer a cold, clinical fear of decommission. It was a hot, vibrant, terrifying fear of the unknown, the fear of what he might find if and when all the doors inside him were finally thrown open. He was falling apart. Or maybe, just maybe, he was being put back together. Kalen watched the boy collapse, his control a thin sheet of ice over a roiling sea of instinct. Every alpha impulse in his body screamed at him to go to Elian, to touch him, to soothe the distress that was rolling off him in palpable waves. He could smell it now, the first stirring of the boy's true scent. It was faint, fragile, laced with the metallic tang of fear and the bitter scent of the suppressants being burned away by his rebelling system. But beneath that, there was something else, something green and alive. Moss after a spring rain, crushed willow bark. It was a scent of quiet, resilient life, and it called to something deep within Kalen's own biology, a resonant hum of recognition that he had not felt in 20 years. He forced himself to remain still. To interfere now, to offer comfort, would be to taint the process. Ellion had to find his own footing in this new sensory landscape. Kalen could be the catalyst, the guide, but he could not be the crutch. The boy had to choose to stand on his own. He lowered the volume of the music, letting the melancholic strings recede into a gentle murmur. He had chosen the piece carefully. Avo Pert's Spiegel, im Spiegel, mirror in the mirror. It was a simple, repetitive structure, designed to be meditative, to encourage introspection. It was a sonic representation of what he was trying to do. Hold up a mirror to Ellion's true self and allow him to see his own reflection for the first time. He thought of the file he had read 100 times, the one buried so deep in the Institute's archives it was practically mythical. Ellion's pre-intake data. He had been brought to the Institute at age 5, a ward of the state, his lineage marked as redacted. But Kalen had sliced through the firewalls, peeled back the layers of bureaucratic encryption. Ellion's mother was an Omega from the outer territories, a place where the old ways still held sway. His father, an unknown Alpha. The boy's genetic profile was a statistical anomaly. He possessed a rare combination of genes that gave him an unprecedented potential for pheromonal sensitivity and empathic resonance, but also an incredibly robust endocrine system. It was this robustness that the Null Protocol's designers had seen as the ultimate challenge. They wanted to prove that even the most potent Omega biology could be neutralized, brought to heel by science. They had subjected him to the most aggressive conditioning regimen ever devised, and for 12 years it had appeared to work. But Kalen saw the truth. The protocol hadn't erased Ellion's nature, it had compressed it. It had taken a vibrant, thriving ecosystem and crushed it down into a diamond-hard point of potential energy. And now, Kalen was methodically removing the pressure. He knew the risks: a catastrophic system shock, a complete psychological break, or, most dangerously, a heat. A full, unsuppressed Omega heat, triggered by the sudden withdrawal of the dampeners. If that happened in this room, with him, an Alpha, the consequences would be dire. The Institute would see it as the ultimate failure of the protocol, and a confirmation of his treason. They would decommission Ellion without a second thought, and they would do far worse to Kalen. But it was a risk he had to take. To leave Ellion in his null state was a quieter, slower kind of death. It was a damnation Kalen was no longer willing to be a party to. Ellion stirred, pushing himself slowly upright. His face was pale, sheened with a fine layer of sweat. He didn't look at Kalen. His eyes were fixed on the apple. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hesitating just above its smooth, red skin. It was the most profound act of defiance Kalen could imagine. A simple, curious gesture. Ellion's fingers made contact. He likely expected the cool, dead smoothness of polymer, the material from which his entire world was constructed. Kalen watched his expression as his fingertips registered the waxy, faintly yielding texture of the apple's skin. a small, sharp intake of breath. He was learning the language of the real. "It's a fruit," Kalen said softly. "It grew on a tree, in the sun and the rain." He was giving him words, concepts to anchor the new sensations. Sun, rain, tree. Words that were just abstract data points in Elian's learning modules, now tied to a tangible object. Elian's fingers curled around the apple, his grip clumsy at first, then more certain. He lifted it. He brought it to his nose, inhaling cautiously. Kalen could see the confusion on his face. The apple scent was sweet and faint, a stark contrast to the overwhelming scent of the forest simulation. It was a focused, specific, real smell. The boy's gaze lifted, finally meeting Kalen's again. The fear was still there, but it was tempered now with a dawning, electrifying curiosity. The question was there, in his eyes, unspoken. "What is this? What are you doing to me?" "I am giving you back what was stolen," Kalen answered the silent question. His own scent, the pine and smoke, deepened infinitesimally, a subconscious offering of reassurance. It was a dangerous game, speaking to the boy on this primal, pheromonal level. But it was the only language his awakening biology would truly understand. Elian continued to stare at him, the apple held tightly in his hand. The seed of rebellion had been planted. Now, Kalen had to see if it would take root in the barren, poisoned soil of the boy's conditioning, or if the whole fragile experiment would shatter into a million pieces. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the ventilation and the quiet thrum of two hearts beating in the same small, locked room. The universe had contracted to this single point, this crucible where a soul was being unmade and remade, all under the watchful, penitent gaze of its creator. Days blurred. The chronometer on the desk was the only marker of time's passage, but Elian found himself ignoring it. His world was no longer measured in seconds and minutes, but in the slow unfurling of new sensations. Kalen operated with a quiet, deliberate rhythm. He would present Elian with new stimuli, then retreat, observing from a distance. He gave him a glass of water, and Elian spent a full hour watching the way the light refracted through it, the tiny condensation beads that formed on its cool surface. He gave him a piece of bread, and the texture, the rough crust and soft interior, the yeasty smell, was a revelation that brought tears to his eyes. He didn't know why he was crying. The emotion was a foreign entity, a wave of salt water rising from a long, dry well. He did not fight it. He simply observed it, just as Kalen was observing him. The music changed. Sometimes it was chaotic and fast, a storm of piano keys that made his heart race. Other times, it was a single human voice, singing a simple melody without words, a sound so full of longing, it made his own bones ache with a nameless yearning. He was a creature being led out of a dark cave into the full glare of the sun. It was painful. It was overwhelming. It was glorious. He started to speak more, not in the flat, compliant tones of Subject 734, but with the halting, questioning voice of Elian. He would hold up an object, a smooth riverstone Kalen had produced from a drawer, a square of dark, bitter chocolate, and ask, "What is its purpose?" At first, Kalen would give him a clinical answer. "It is a silicate rock, smoothed by water erosion. Its purpose is aesthetic and tactile." But as the days passed, his answers became different. "Its purpose is to feel cool in your hand, to remind you of the passage of time." Of the chocolate, he said, "Its purpose is to be a surprise, to be bitter and sweet at the same time." These answers confused and fascinated Elian. Purpose was not meant to be abstract. It was meant to be functional. Yet he was beginning to understand. The purpose of the music was not to regulate brainwaves, but to make him feel. The purpose of the apple was not just nutrition, but joy. One evening, after the room's lights had dimmed to a soft twilight glow, Kalen sat across from him, not behind the desk, but in the other polymer chair, creating an illusion of equality. "Tell me about your dreams," Kalen said. "The Institute's reports say you don't have any. The dampeners are designed to suppress REM sleep." "I don't," Elian said automatically. Then he paused. He looked down at his hands. "There is a place, not a dream, a feeling." He struggled to find the words. Language was a new tool, and he was clumsy with it. "It's grey and quiet. There's a smell, like the air before it rains." "Petrichor," Kalen supplied softly. "Yes." Elian looked up, his eyes wide. "And there's a sound. Water. Hitting glass. A memory. A flicker. So faint it was like trying to catch smoke. It was from before. Before the white rooms, before the suppressants, before he was 7 to 34. The image was a ghost, but the feeling it evoked was solid. It was a feeling of safety, of being held. The memory was a key, and it unlocked something deep within him. A scent bloomed from his skin, stronger than ever before. It was no longer faint or laced with fear. It was the smell of that memory. The rich, clean scent of rain-soaked earth, of ozone from a distant storm, of wet stones in a riverbed. It was his scent. It was him. The scent filled the small room, a living presence. He watched Kalen, terrified of his reaction. He had been taught his scent was a contamination, a biohazard to be contained and eradicated. He expected disgust or anger. Instead, Kalen's eyes closed for a moment. His expression was one of profound, sorrowful concentration. He breathed in, a long, slow inhalation. When he opened his eyes, the pale grey was dark, turbulent, like a storm gathering over the sea. The alpha scent in the room, the pine and smoke, thickened, responding to Elian's own, a call and answer on a level below conscious thought. It was not an aggressive scent. It was grounding, a deep, resonant anchor in the swirling storm of Elian's reawakening. "That," Kalen said, his voice a low rumble, "is you. That is what they tried to erase." Elian stared at him, his heart hammering against his ribs. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but it was mingled now with something else, a fragile, tentative trust. This man, who had been the embodiment of the system that had broken him, was now the only person who could see him, truly see him. "Why?" Elian whispered, the question raw, torn from the deepest part of him. "Why are you doing this?" Kalen leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. The dim light carved shadows on his face, making him look older, weary. "Because I helped create the null protocol," he said, the words stark and heavy in the quiet room. "I wrote the code for the neurological dampeners. I calibrated the first somatic conditioning machines. I stood by and watched as we perfected the art of turning children into ghosts." His confession hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. He did not look away. He forced Elian to see the full weight of his guilt. "I convinced myself it was for the greater good. That order was preferable to freedom. That a painless existence was better than a painful one. I was a fool. A monster dressed in the robes of a scientist." He finally broke eye contact, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I saw your file. I saw your potential. The system flagged you as a risk because of your strength, your resilience. They saw a threat. I saw a chance to undo one terrible wrong. Atonement. The word was barely a breath. Elian felt a strange, sharp pang in his chest. It was not his own pain. It was a reflection, an echo of the immense, soul-crushing regret that radiated from the man in front of him. For the first time, he saw Kalen not as a proctor, not as an alpha, but as a person. A broken person trying to piece together something he had shattered. In that moment, the last of the walls between them, the hierarchy of proctor and subject, crumbled into dust. They were just two people in a locked room, surrounded by the wreckage of the past, trying to find a way forward. Elian took a slow breath, inhaling the mingled scents of rain-soaked earth and pine smoke. The combination felt right. In a world that had been nothing but wrong, it was the first thing that felt true. The confession changed the atmosphere in the room. The tension did not vanish, but it transformed. It was no longer the taut wire of uncertainty and fear between a captor and his captive. It was now the charged, humming space between two co-conspirators, two survivors sharing a fragile sanctuary. Kalen began to talk more, not as a teacher, but as a historian, a witness. He told Elian about the world before the institutes, a world of chaotic, vibrant cities, of art and unplanned nature, of families that were not designated but chosen. He spoke of Omegas, who were not seen as liabilities to be managed, but as cornerstones of their communities, of alphas who led not through pheromonal dominance, but through respect. He painted a picture of a world that sounded like a fever dream, a beautiful, impossible myth. And as he spoke, he dismantled the foundational lies of Elian's education, brick by brick. The lie that biology was a flaw, the lie that emotion was a weakness, the lie that control was the same as peace. Kalen's guilt was a palpable thing. It was in the weary lines around his eyes, in the careful way he held himself, as if constantly restraining a deep well of self-loathing. He had created a system of sensory deprivation, and now he was atoning by curating a world of sensory richness for Elian. He never touched him. The space between them remained sacrosanct, a boundary Kalen seemed to have imposed on himself with iron discipline. But his presence was a constant, steady warmth in the cold room. His scent was a source of stability, a low, constant hum of pine and smoke that calmed the frantic buzzing that had lived under Elian's skin for so long. Kalen, in turn, found himself observing Elian with a feeling that went beyond scientific curiosity or the need for atonement. He was captivated by the process of his becoming. He watched Elian discover the simple pleasure of stretching his limbs, of feeling the texture of a wool blanket, of tasting a drop of honey. Each new discovery was a quiet miracle. The boy's scent was a living barometer of his internal state. It would sour with the bitter smell of ozone when he encountered a painful memory, and it would sweeten with the scent of fresh water and new leaves when he experienced a moment of peace. One cycle, Kalen brought in a data slate and showed Elian an image of the ocean. It was a vast, moving expanse of blue under a wide sky. Elian stared at it for a long time, his expression unreadable. "The water is angry," he finally said. Kalen looked at the image. It was a calm day, the waves gentle. "Why do you say that?" "It never stops," Elian murmured, his eyes wide. "It's always moving, pushing. It wants to get out." Kalen felt a chill. The boy wasn't just seeing an image. He was empathizing with it. He was projecting his own life of containment onto the sea. He was not just reawakening his senses. His innate, powerful Omega empathy was coming online, a faculty the Null Protocol had been most desperate to suppress. It was this empathy that made Omegas so influential, so dangerous to a regime built on emotional disconnection. That night, a new and alarming change began. A deep, radiating warmth started in Elian's core, a slow, insistent heat that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. A dull ache settled in his lower back. He felt restless, his skin too tight, his thoughts scattered and hazy. He tried to hide it, ashamed of the sudden lack of control over his own body. He curled up on the small cot that recessed from the wall, wrapping himself in the wool blanket, trying to will the strange feelings away. But the heat only grew, coiling in his belly like a hot snake. His scent began to change again. The clean smell of petrichor was still there, but it was being overlaid with something else, something sweeter and more complex. The smell of blooming nightshade, of warm honey, of a deep, musky spice he couldn't name. It was a scent designed to entice, to call, to announce. Kalen noticed it immediately. He grew very still, his posture rigid. He had been reading a data slate, but his hands froze over the screen. His head lifted, his nostrils flaring almost imperceptibly. His own scent in the room sharpened, the pine and smoke becoming more potent, more concentrated. It was a scent of alarm and of deep, primal focus. "Elian," he said, his voice strained, a low growl that was more alpha than Proctor. Elian didn't answer. He pressed his face into the blanket, a wave of dizziness washing over him. The heat was intensifying, becoming a liquid fire that pooled in his veins. A soft, involuntary sound escaped his lips, a whimper of distress. In 2 silent strides, Kalen was across the room, kneeling by the cot. He did not touch him. He kept a careful foot of distance between them, but his presence was overwhelming. "Elian, listen to me," he said, his voice urgent but controlled. "Your body is rebooting. The suppressants are gone. Your natural cycle is beginning. This is your first heat." The word hung in the air, a terrifying clinical term that Elian had only ever read in cautionary files. Heat, a state of extreme biological vulnerability, characterized by pheromonal distress signals, cognitive degradation, and an overwhelming instinct for procreation, a critical failure state. His conditioning screamed at him. Failure, contaminant, defect. Panic seized him, cold and sharp. His breath hitched, his heart rabbiting against his ribs. "No," he gasped, the word choked with a terror so profound it stole his voice. "Make it stop." Kalen's face was a mask of grim control. His own body was at war with itself. The scent rolling off Elian was a siren song to his alpha biology, a potent, intoxicating perfume that bypassed all his higher functions and spoke directly to his instincts. His every cell screamed at him to claim, to soothe, to possess. It took every ounce of his 2 decades of disciplined control to remain kneeling, to keep his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I cannot stop it," he said, his voice rough. "It is a part of you. It is not a flaw. It is not a sickness. It is life." He could see the boy was on the verge of a full-blown panic attack, his conditioning doing battle with his rebelling biology. Kalen had to anchor him, to pull him back from the edge. He made a decision, a terrible, necessary risk. Slowly, deliberately, he began to release his own scent. Not the scent of an alpha asserting dominance, but a carefully controlled, calming scent. He focused on the notes of pine, of cool stone, of steady, burning embers. It was a scent that spoke of safety, of stability, of shelter. He pushed it out, a pheromonal blanket to wrap around Elian's frantic, spiraling panic. "Breathe with me, Elian," he commanded softly. "Focus on my scent. Let it ground you. You are not a failure. You are not broken. You are becoming whole." Elian's world had dissolved into a disorienting haze of heat and need, a storm of sensation without context. His body was a stranger to him, driven by impulses he couldn't understand and didn't know how to control. The ingrained shame and fear from his conditioning were a toxic layer on top of the raw, biological imperative. He was drowning. Then, through the chaos, came Kalen's scent. It wasn't an assault. It was a lifeline. The steady, clean aroma of pine and smoke cut through the cloying sweetness of his own heat scent, giving him something to hold on to. It was solid ground in a churning sea. He instinctively did as he was told, dragging in a ragged breath, then another. He focused on the scent, letting it fill his lungs, his head. It smelled of ancient forests and quiet strength. It smelled of safety. The raging panic inside him began to subside, the frantic edge softening into a deep, aching vulnerability. The heat was still there, a powerful tide pulling at him, but he was no longer lost in it. He was anchored. He opened his eyes, his vision blurry with unshed tears. Kalen was still kneeling beside him, his face etched with a fierce concentration. He looked like a man holding back a tidal wave through sheer force of will. Elian could see the corded muscles in his neck, the faint tremor in his clenched fists. He was fighting his own instincts for him. A wave of something warm and profound washed over Elian, an emotion so powerful it eclipsed the heat for a moment. It was a fierce, protective surge of gratitude, trust. He had been taught that alphas were a danger, a force to be submitted to or fled from. But this alpha, his creator and his liberator, was using his strength not to dominate, but to shield. Unthinking, driven by an instinct deeper than his conditioning and newer than his fear, he reached out a trembling hand. He didn't touch Kalen's skin. He simply laid his hand on Kalen's forearm, over the rough fabric of his uniform. The contact was an explosion, a jolt of pure energy, of connection arced between them. It was not sexual. It was something far more fundamental, a recognition, a completion. Mine. The thought was not his own. It was a deep, resonant chord that hummed through the bond that had just snapped into place between them. He felt it echoed back from Kalen, a silent, stunned shock of acceptance. Mine. They were bonded, not through a bite, not through a claiming, but through a moment of shared vulnerability and profound, freely given trust. The universe, which had been a chaotic, terrifying storm, suddenly had a new, calm center. And it was the man kneeling beside him. The moment of connection, the silent, shocking snap of a bond forming, was a cataclysm for Kalen. It was a phenomenon he had only ever read about in forbidden, pre-institute texts. A true bond, formed not by biology alone, but by a perfect alignment of trust, empathy, and mutual recognition. It was a legend, a myth, and it was happening to him, here, in this sterile room, with the boy he had sworn to save. He felt the echo of Elian's nascent thought, mine, resonate in his own soul, answered by a possessive, protective surge so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. His entire being, every alpha instinct he possessed, reoriented itself around a new magnetic north. The Omega curled on the cot, whose scent was now inextricably woven with his own. The heat scent of nightshade and honey was still there, but it was underpinned by the clean, grounding smell of petrichor. And now it was laced with the faint, phantom aroma of Kalen's own pine and smoke. They were marked, intertwined, on a level that transcended the physical. The boy's hand on his arm was a brand. The sight of Elian looking at him, his eyes wide with dawning comprehension and a trust so absolute it was terrifying, broke through the last of Kalen's carefully constructed walls. His guilt, his regret, his lonely crusade for atonement, it all coalesced into a single, fierce, and unwavering purpose. Protect him at any cost. The heat, however, was still a biological reality. The bond had calmed Elian's panic, but it had not doused the fire. If anything, the new connection made it more potent, more focused. The vague, instinctual need was no longer aimless. It was directed entirely at Kalen. He could feel it, a tangible pull, a silent plea. Kalen withdrew his arm, the loss of contact a physical pain. He stood up, putting distance between them once more. He had to think. He had to control this. He could not, would not, take advantage of the boy in this state. To do so would make him no better than the system he despised. It would be the ultimate betrayal. The bond changes things, Kalen said, his voice rougher than he intended. But it does not change this. I will not hurt you, Elian. I will not take what you cannot freely give. Elian pushed himself up, his movements slow, languid with the fever of the heat. The blanket fell away. His eyes were dark, his pupils blown wide. He was looking at Kalen with a raw, unguarded need that was devastating to witness. It doesn't hurt, he whispered, his voice husky. It feels right. Stay, please. The plea was a physical blow. Kalen's control, already strained to its breaking point, began to fray. He could smell the subtle shift in Elian's scent, the honeyed note deepening, an open invitation. This was the most dangerous moment. He had to anchor both of them. He walked to the small kitchenette and filled a glass with cold water. He brought it to the cot, his movements stiff, precise. He did not hand it to Elian. He placed it on the floor beside him. Drink, he commanded, his voice the clipped, authoritative tone of the proctor. It was a shield, a role he could retreat into. Your body is under immense strain. You must hydrate. He then went to the far side of the room, by the door, putting the entire length of the space between them. He sat on the floor, his back against the cold, hard metal, and closed his eyes. He was creating a boundary, a clear, physical denial of the instincts that were raging within them both. I will stay, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I will not leave you, but I will not touch you. You will get through this. And when you are on the other side, when your mind is clear, you will be the one to choose what happens next. That is my promise to you. For the next 36 hours, he kept his vigil. He listened to Elian's soft whimpers, to the rustle of the blanket as he tossed and turned. He breathed in the intoxicating, torturous scent of his heat and answered it with a steady, unwavering broadcast of calm and safety. He did not sleep. He did not eat. He became a sentinel, a guardian standing watch over the most profound and painful transformation he had ever witnessed. It was an act of penance. It was an act of devotion. He was an alpha, using his strength not to take, but to protect. He was a creator, safeguarding his creation. He was a man, discovering for the first time in his desolate life the terrifying, beautiful, and absolute meaning of the word love. The fever broke like a storm. One moment, Elian was adrift in a sea of fire and need, anchored only by the distant, steady scent of pine and smoke. The next, the heat receded, leaving behind a profound exhaustion and a startling, crystalline clarity. He felt empty, but not the hollowed-out emptiness of his null state. This was a clean, quiet space, a room that had been scoured by fire, ready for new life. He sat up, the wool blanket pooled around his waist. The air in the room was thick with the lingering sense of their ordeal, a complex perfume of his heat and Kalen's fierce, protective control. It smelled like them. He looked across the room. Kalen was exactly where he had been, slumped against the door, his eyes closed. He looked depleted, the lines of exhaustion carved deep into his face. But even in sleep, his posture was watchful. A fierce, tender protectiveness swelled in Elian's chest. This man had walked through fire for him, had denied his own nature to protect his. He felt the bond between them, a warm, shining thread that stretched across the room, connecting them. It was a tangible thing, a quiet hum beneath his skin. It felt like coming home to a place he'd never known. He stood, his legs shaky, and walked to the kitchenette. He poured a glass of water, his movements slow but steady. He crossed the room and knelt in front of Kalen. He hesitated for only a moment before gently touching his shoulder. Kalen's eyes snapped open. The pale grey was sharp, instantly alert. The proctor was gone. The scientist was gone. The man who looked at him was just Kalen, and his eyes were filled with a raw, unguarded emotion that made Elian's breath catch. "It's over," Elian said softly. He offered the glass of water. Kalen stared at it, then at Elian's face. He took the glass, his fingers brushing Elian's, and the simple touch was as powerful as the first. He drank, his throat working. The sound was loud in the quiet room. "Are you all right?" Kalen asked, his voice hoarse. "I am," Elian said, and he was surprised by the simple, profound truth of the words. "I am whole." He was more than whole. His senses, which had been slowly reawakening, were now vividly, painfully alive. He could hear the faint electronic buzz of the light panels, see the individual fibers in the grey fabric of Kalen's uniform, feel the subtle temperature difference in the air near the ventilation unit, and his sense of smell. It was a universe. He could pass every note in Kalen's scent, the sharp tang of pine, the deep resin, the comforting warmth of smoke, the cool, clean scent of stone, and underneath it all, a unique, personal scent that was just Kalen. But it was his empathy that had changed the most. He was no longer just sensing Kalen's emotions. He was feeling them as if they were his own. He felt the deep well of his exhaustion, the bone-deep relief, the lingering guilt, and a powerful, overwhelming wave of love directed at him. It was so intense, it was almost dizzying. He knew, with an absolute certainty that required no words, that Kalen would die for him, and he knew he would do the same. "The Institute," Elian said, the name of the place a foreign, ugly sound. "They will have registered the failure of the suppressants. They will have detected the pheromonal spike." Kalen nodded, his expression turning grim. He was already shifting from caretaker to strategist. "They will have. The telemetry from your biomonitor would have sent every alarm in the facility screaming, but I rerouted it. As far as the system knows, you are stable. A perfect null." He paused. "But the system is not the only threat. There are people, my colleagues. They are not fools. They will have noted my absence. They will have questions." The sanctuary of their locked room was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage, and the hunters were gathering outside. The time for healing and discovery was over. The time for war was beginning. "What do we do?" Elian asked. For the first time, he used the word "we." It felt as natural as breathing. Kalen looked at him, and a slow, faint smile touched his lips. It was the first time Elian had ever seen him smile, and it transformed his severe face, lighting it from within. "First," Kalen said, his voice regaining its strength, "we erase Subject 734 from the system. We give Elian a new history, a new identity. I built this prison, Elian. I know all its secret passages." He stood, pulling Elian up with him. He did not let go of his hand. The contact was solid, real. "Then," he continued, his pale eyes burning with a cold, determined fire, "we walk out that door, and we tear it all down." The plan was audacious, born of desperation and a shared, defiant hope. For the next several hours, Kalen worked at the desk terminal, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. He was no longer a proctor. He was a ghost in the machine, his own creation turned against its masters. Elian watched, a silent partner, as Kalen moved through layers of security with an intimate, contemptuous ease. He was like a poison, flowing back through the veins of the system to attack its heart. He didn't just delete Elian's file. He rewrote it, weaving a complex narrative of a failed specimen, quietly decommissioned due to neurological degradation. He buried the real data logs of Elian's reawakening under terabytes of corrupted code, a digital time bomb for anyone who dug too deep. He fabricated transfer orders, created a new identity for Elian, a low-level acolyte from a remote sector, assigned to a menial data processing task on the far side of the facility. It was a flimsy cover, but it was enough to get them through the initial checkpoints. As Kalen worked, Elian packed the few items they had accumulated in the room. The smooth river stone, the last piece of the dark chocolate, the wool blanket. They were just objects, but they were the relics of his rebirth, and he would not leave them behind. When Kalen was finished, he wiped the terminal, leaving no trace of his digital treason. He stood and turned to Elian. The room was once again a sterile white office, but for the two of them, it would forever be a sacred space, a crucible, a home. "It's time," Kalen said. His face was calm, but through the bond, Elian could feel the thrum of his tension, the tightly coiled readiness for the fight to come. He walked to the door, placing his hand on the lock panel. There was a soft chime, a hiss of depressurization, and the magnetic lock clicked open. The sound was deafening. For days that sound had meant confinement, safety, a world apart. Now it meant danger. It meant freedom. Kalen looked at Elian, a silent question in his eyes. "Are you ready?" Elian met his gaze and nodded. He was no longer the trembling, compliant subject who had entered this room. He was not a null. He was an Omega, bonded and whole, and he was walking into a war beside his Alpha. He squared his shoulders, a gesture of quiet defiance that was entirely his own. Kalen opened the door. The hallway outside was exactly as Elian remembered. Sterile, white and silent, bathed in the cold, unblinking light of the Institute. But it looked different now. He was seeing it with new eyes. He could smell the faint, antiseptic tang of the air scrubbers, the lingering pheromonal residue of fear and compliance from the hundreds of other subjects who walked these halls. It was the smell of a tomb. They stepped out together. Kalen's presence beside him was a solid, reassuring warmth. They walked, their steps synchronized, their pace measured. They were a portrait of conformity, a proctor and his acolyte. but beneath the surface they were a revolution of two. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with another Proctor. Elian's body went rigid, a lifetime of conditioned fear flooding his system. The Proctor, a stern-faced woman with cold eyes, looked at Kaelin. Then her gaze flickered to Elian, a brief, dismissive glance. "Kaelin," she said, her voice sharp, "you've been off-grid. The director has been asking for your analysis on the latest null batch." Kaelin's expression was perfectly neutral. "I was running a deep diagnostic on a containment protocol failure. This acolyte," he said, gesturing vaguely at Elian, "was assisting with the data retrieval." Through the bond, Elian felt a surge of Kaelin's ice-cold calm, a pheromonal shield that masked his own terror. The Proctor's eyes narrowed slightly, her senses picking up something odd. The air around Kaelin and his companion was too neutral, too clean. It was the scent of a carefully constructed lie. But Kaelin's authority was absolute. She nodded curtly. "See that the report is on the director's desk by the next cycle." "Of course," Kaelin said. They walked past her. Elian did not breathe until they had turned another corner. He felt Kaelin's hand briefly squeeze his, a silent message of reassurance. They were in the open now. Every moment was a risk. Every glance was a potential threat. But for the first time in his life, Elian was not afraid. He was walking toward an unknown future, a world he had only ever heard about in stories. There would be sun and rain. There would be angry oceans and quiet forests. There would be pain and joy, bitterness and sweetness. It would be chaotic and unpredictable. He looked at the man walking beside him, the man who had torn down his prison and then taken his hand. He inhaled the scent of pine and smoke and rain-soaked earth, the scent of his bond, his home. He was walking into the fight of his life, and he was not alone.